How can you get into poetry as a beginner? This is one of the most popular, common questions that I get. It's funny, whenever I make anything poetry related, it's never seemed like the most popular topic, but the engagement is quite strong, which tells me that a lot of people just don't really get poetry or feel like it might be beyond their understanding, which is a shame. If you can't unlock the power of poetry, then you're cutting off a really strong, deep wellspring of the human condition that's really nourishing. So let's real quick, I'm going to just pretend that you're someone who's come to me and has said, where can I start with poetry? And I'm going to give you a few recommendations to get started. We're going to focus primarily on the Pocket Poets series, and I'm going to give you a couple of authors and direct you to a few poems that are my personal favourite that I think you'll get something out of. A few quick tips: when you read them, make sure you slow down. Don't be put off by initial difficulty or not understanding it. You will go into each and every poem seeking to reread it a few times. It's the rereading that unlocks meaning. And try to read it out loud. Now, some people say, oh, I feel silly doing that. Well, if you're by yourself, who's there to feel silly in front of? It is the meaning in your mouth, it's the sound, it's the feel of the words that also unlocks meaning. You could also try reading it to someone else. Let's try and bring that back. People used to read poetry to each other, didn't they? We don't do that anymore. We just binge stuff, which is fine. I like binging stuff as well, but there's a real nice quality, a slowed down, simpler time quality to reading a bit of poetry. So, first things first, let's get this out of the way. A real easy way to get started with poetry is simply to get a really good anthology. And you can see I've absolutely torn this one apart. This is the best poems of the English language from Chaucer through Robert Frost. And it's edited by Harold Bloom, who was a huge influence on me. This is a really good anthology. I would recommend dipping in and just, flipping through and seeing if you can find anything. Now, specific poets. I'm going to show you my Everyman Pocket Poets collection. This isn't all of them, but it's a good chunk of them. Check this out. There you go. Okay, so I'm going to confine myself to 4 or 5 that I think you'll like. First things first, I think Keats is one of the most accessible poets. He's also the most beautiful. I get a lot of strong, obvious, overt pleasure from reading a poem by Keats. Tragically, his life was cut off in his 20s. He didn't live that long. It's a shame because if you read his writings, he's talking about how he just needs another 10 years before he gets really good. He wants to spend more time in the company of great poets, writing, creating his own mythology. And when he was saying that, he basically only had 4 years left of his life, 3 years left writing poetry. He was very, very ill all his life, had tuberculosis. He went through a lot of suffering, lost his brother. He had a hard life, and he also wasn't classically educated or formally educated. He was, at least not in the art of poetry, beautiful, right? So if you get the Pocket Everyman version of John Keats, you can read any of these, but I would particularly direct your attention to a few of my favourites. Any of the odes are good. There's Ode to a Nightingale, beautiful. Ode on a Grecian Urn, that's really good. Ode to Psyche, Ode on Melancholy. You might also like To Autumn. What other poems has he got? Okay, my favourite Keats poem is La Belle Dame sans Merci. Oh, what can ail thee, knight at arms, alone and palely loitering? The sedge has withered from the lake, and no bird sings. It's a great one. You might also want to read his Bright Star sonnet. It's the best sonnet that Keats ever wrote. It was written on a blank page in Shakespeare's poems. That's a really good one. You might want to dip into some of his longer poems. The Eve of St. Agnes. On First Looking into Chapman's Homer is really, really good. When I Have Fears is good. To the One Who Has Been Long in City Pent is amazing. On Sitting Down to Read King Lear once again is amazing. So yes, I would recommend you start with Keats. Next up, Tennyson. He was a Victorian poet laureate. He was really affected by the death of his good friend and influence, Arthur Hallam. All of his great poetry is tinged with grief. He never really got over it. Tennyson is untaught these days. People are averse to him, which is a shame because he really understands the weight of the language. He is a master, really evocative. I would highly recommend Alfred Lord Tennyson. And I would say you should start with, and we'll do a deep dive into Tennyson on the podcast at some point. I would recommend, if you want to start with a really short one, famous one, The Eagle. That's very, very short. But after that, go into his narrative poems. We're talking Tithonus, We're also talking Ulysses, okay? I would also recommend Mariana, okay? You could also read The Charge of the Light Brigade. That's one that's done in schools and stuff. But Tennyson, really, really good. If you get both of these, then weigh them up against each other. They're very, very different. Tell me which one you prefer. Next up, let's talk about romantics. Shelley. I love Shelley. I would highly recommend, you can read Ozymandias if you want a short one, but read Ode to the West Wind. Powerful, powerful stuff. You might also like To a Skylark, Prometheus Unbound, Mont Blanc, okay, Hymn to Intellectual Beauty. But Shelley was a sublime romantic poet about, the power of nature, how it makes us humans feel infinitesimally small. One of his most difficult poems, one of the most difficult poems, The Triumph of Life. That is his death poem, his unfinished death poem. So, Shelley. Want something a bit more current, but not super modern? Yeats. Yeats is great, Irish poet. Lake Isle of Innisfree. You might also like Sailing to Byzantium. He's really, really good. Who else? We can also, I don't like Wordsworth, the man, but there's no denying that he's written some very evocative stuff. Lines written above Tintern Abbey, anything from the Prelude, the Solitary Reaper, that sort of thing. We can go into many more poets if you like, but I think that's a good sort of beginner's starter pack guide to poetry. And then just throw yourself in and slow down, okay? Let the meaning work upon you, be patient, read them aloud, and then let me know who you like, what poems you like, and why. Also, it might be worth saying that if you wanted a guided beginner's tour down the dusty halls and corridors of rewarding and nourishing poetry, you might want to sign up to the Hardcore Literature Book Club. Link in the description below. At the moment, we've got a great big read, Anna Karenina, and then we're moving on to Crime and Punishment, but we're also reading short stories, and we're doing deep dives into the great poets. Our first great poet is going to be Robert Browning, and then we're going to look at Emily Dickinson. Then we're going to look at some of the romantics like Shelley and Blake. It's going to be good. We're going to look at Keats as well in the summer. So check it out. Join the Proust tier today, say hi, and join in the fun. Happy reading.